This week, I'm going to be talking about critical disability studies and its application to library services. The goals for this lecture are to understand the history of disability studies, to locate some approaches of critical disability studies, and to think about how critical disability studies can apply to the library. In 1990, the American Disabilities Act became law. The ADA is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life, including jobs, schools, transportation, and all public and private places that are open to the general public. The purpose of this law is to make sure that people with disabilities have the same rights and opportunities as everyone else. However, although the ADA became law in 1990, disability studies started to emerge with disability activism in the 1970s and 1980s. In 1986, the section for the study of chronic illness, impairment, and disability of the Social Science Association was renamed the Society for Disability Studies. And in 1994, the first U.S. disability studies program emerged at Syracuse University. In 1997, the first edition of the Disability Studies Reader was published. And the field around disability studies grew rapidly within the next decade. In 2005, the Modern Language Association established disability studies as a division of study. Disability studies grew out of the independent living movements and gained momentum as people with disabilities and their advocates began deeper and more active engagement in the political process to affect and change public policy. With this basis of social activism, many disability theorists began to question the exclusive focus on disability as a sickness or impairment that needed to be corrected and instead they favored a theoretical approach that takes into account the ways in which society used images and language to shape notions of ability and disability. Disability studies grew exponentially among universities as degrees, majors, and as fields of study. Disability studies uses an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approach. It often sits at the intersection of many overlapping programs and disciplines in the humanities, sciences, and social sciences. Disability studies encourages a curriculum that allows students, activists, teachers, artists, practitioners, and researchers to engage at these intersections. Disability studies challenges the view of disability that an individual is deficit or defect, and that should be rehabilitated through medicine. Rather, disability studies explores models and theories that examine social, political, cultural, and economic factors that define disability and help determine personal and collective responses to difference. Disability studies also works to destigmatize disease, illness, and impairment, including for those who cannot be measured or explained by biological science. While acknowledging that medical research and intervention is useful, disability studies interrogates the connections between medical practice and the stigmatization of disability. So disability studies the national and international perspectives, policies, literatures, cultures, and histories with the aim of placing current ideas of disability within a broader context. It also encourages the participation of disabled students and faculty and prioritizes leadership positions among disabled people. There are many forms and sort of subgenres within this field of critical disability studies. Sonora Taylor, who's an activist whose video we watched this week, who is interviewed by Judith Butler, says that disability is essentially the disabling effects of society. And this is the critical approach to disability studies. Recent conversations among academics, advocates, and disability theorists have moved towards a critical disability studies lens with multiple subgenres and intersections. These are named CRIP theory, DisCrit, disability studies, and CRIP queer studies. These are often intersectional, meaning that they touch on various issues that we've discussed in this class, such as disability, ethnicity, race, gender, and sexuality. Recent scholarship has also included studies that explore the intersection between disability and race. Authors and scholars such as Ellen Samuels explores gender, queer sexualities, and disability. There's also studies in ableism and moving beyond the preoccupation with disability to explore the maintenance of ableism in society. There's also recent work that bridges ethnicity and disability studies within the fields of education, and as well as bringing together critical race studies. This work reflects an effort to look at the histories of the marked racially othered body as physically and morally deficit, and this traces the history of scientific racism. Another subgenre within critical disability studies is feminist disability studies. Feminist disability studies takes the form of academic and activism. Under the realm of theory, Emory English professor Rosemary Garland Thompson says, feminist disability studies questions our assumptions that disability is a flaw, lack, or excess. It defines disability broadly from a social rather than a medical perspective. Disability, it argues, is a cultural interpretation of human variation rather than an inherent inferiority, a pathology to cure, or an undesirable trait to eliminate. In other words, it finds disability significance in interactions between bodies and their social and material environments. Feminist disability studies focuses on the disabled body and the changing representations of itself and society. Anne Fausto Sterling, in her article, The Bare Bones of Sex, Part 1, notes that at least two different types of critique parallel and foreshadow possible feminist approaches to a reconsideration of the body. The first demands that we recognize the material constraints on the disabled body in its variable forms and that we integrate that recognition into theory. The second, more radical move is to suggest that the disabled body changes the process of representation itself. This latter approach offers a rich resource for feminist theories of representation and another possible entry point into the analysis of materiality in actual lived-in bodies. Feminist disability studies also takes the form of activism. Feminist writer Anna Hamilton says, feminist disability theory and studies not only offers new possibilities for feminist theory as a whole, but powerfully illuminates issues that have traditionally been important to feminist theory in new and exciting ways, including, and this could include abortion and prenatal testing, assisted suicides and the right to die, pace of life issues, media culture, cultural messages about the body, the experience of chronic illness and pain, the social construction of normative versus non-normative bodies, the medical establishment, labor, and sexuality. Critical disability studies has also been advocated specifically as a methodology. So Julie Avril-Minnick notes that in spite of this renaissance in critical disability studies, people with disabilities continue to remain marginalized and unseen or hypervisible in the United States. Recent reports from the Department of Labor note that the participation rate of disabled people is 19.2%, compared with 68.1% of able-bodied people. So Julie Minnick advocates using disability studies as a methodology rather than a subject. She says, As I would define it, it involves in scrutinizing not bodily or mental impairments, but the social norms that define particular attributes as impairments, as well as the conditions that concentrate stigmatized attributes in particular populations, to engage actively with cultural and material productions of difference. She scrutinizes the normative ideologies that occur with the goal of producing knowledge, but without the support of justice for people with stigmatized bodies and minds. In other words, she argues for naming disability studies as a methodology in order to do social justice work rather than just talking about it as a theory. Crip theory is a section of disability studies that's particularly been taken on by theorist and academic Robert McRuer, and you'll see a video from McRuer as well. For McRuer, crip theory is both an adjective and a verb. McRuer says that as an adjective, this idea of crip has the power to transform. He says crip culture is about saying that disabled people's movements and experiences can transform culture. As a verb, McRuer asks, what might it mean to crip something? To crip something means to insist that disabled experiences, embodiments, and behaviors that are often excluded be brought back into the conversation, to insist that if we're going to talk about something like capitalism or neoliberal capitalism, to crip that is to scrutinize it, to ask how the political economy is on a whole devastating for disabled people. We talked about neoliberalism and neoliberal economics last week, and neoliberal economics really overlaps into and is scrutinized by disability studies. Neoliberalism says that anyone who needs welfare assistance or state assistance or public assistance is not pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. So, relating to neoliberalism, disability is presented as an individual responsibility, that the disabled person just needs to try hard enough to make themselves able-bodied within society's norms. So neoliberal doctrine then really overlooks and really marginalizes disabled people by cutting off various forms of state funding, public assistance to things like the Affordable Care Act. So then crip theory really scrutinizes neoliberal economics. So thinking about critical disability studies in the library, how might we apply and incorporate these various intersectional approaches of critical disability studies to the library space as a theory and a method? And how would we change the language in the library if we used critical disability studies approaches?